friends, welcome back to Food Prep Guide. Today's video is inspired by a recent comment we received on YouTube asking about my opinion on freeze-dried versus dehydrated food because I have both a freeze dryer and a dehydrator. And I thought that was a fantastic question because it's actually one that I have thought a lot about, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But I want to go through the pros and cons of a dehydrator and a freeze dryer. I want to talk about which specific foods and meal types that I choose, which device I choose for each type of food. And then at the very end of the video, I have some samples here of side-by-side dehydrated versus freeze-dried, and I want to take you through the texture differences, the rehydration differences, and I just want you to be able to see a side-by-side comparison of dehydrated versus freeze-dried food, and then I will let you know my personal opinion, just one opinion of many, of which type of machine might be best for which type of person and lifestyle. Let's get started.
By the way, if you would like help building your food storage, scroll down to the description box of this video and click this link for our free 1-year food storage plan. We calculated a year's supply of food for one person, then broke that data down into a week-by-week list of items to build your pantry on a budget. We'll send it straight to your inbox. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss all of our upcoming food preservation, pantry storage, and gardening tutorials. Now back to the kitchen.
So to begin, I just want to give you some background information about my use with both machines so that you can just have a frame of reference of which to watch this video. So I have been dehydrating food in an Excalibur 5 tray, I believe, for about 8 years now. It was my very first entrance into food preservation, and I absolutely love it. For about 2 years there, I literally ran it day and night for 2 years straight. It is still kicking, still going strong. I absolutely love it. I am also the owner of a Harvest Right extra large freeze dryer. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer here, and this kind of shapes the way that I view freeze drying a little bit, and that is that I did not have to pay for the freeze dryer. A family member reached out to me and we worked out a deal where he would finance it as long as I kind of produced food for both families, and it has worked out fantastic. It stays here at my house so that I can easily produce food and freeze dry it and then send it over to them, and it just works out great. So as I have been thinking about this question of is a freeze dryer worth it, or do I really need a freeze dryer, I have had this frame of reference of I didn't have to pay for it, so of course my answer is it's worth it because I didn't have to invest anything. I didn't have to lose anything to gain that, right? But I think that's interesting because even though I didn't have to pay for it, I actually have an opinion that might surprise you. So let's get started on which food types I prefer and recommend for each different machine. So for the freeze dryer first, I want to go through that one first because everything else that I don't list for the freeze dryer, the dehydrator does just fine. It does a fantastic job. The restrictions on a dehydrator are much more than a freeze dryer because we can't do dairy products. We can't do like our eggs. I have tried that once and it was fine, but it just wasn't the greatest end product in the world. And as far as meats go, we're pretty limited there as well because most meats that you're going to get out of a dehydrator are going to be your jerky style meats. Now with that said, I do and have and will continue to dehydrate ground venison because it has worked just fine for my family. Just a disclaimer, that is not recommended by the food powers that be to dehydrate ground meat in your regular dehydrator. I've been doing it for years, following all the safety things that I know, and it has been working out fine. But just so you know, we are very limited with meats in a dehydrator. Now, a freeze dryer opens up a whole new world of opportunities when it comes to freeze drying beyond the fruit and veggie categories. So my favorite things for the dehydrator is definitely going to be eggs. As a chicken owner, or freeze drying, I guess I can't remember if I said dehydrating or not, but freeze drying eggs is definitely an excellent way to keep those eggs in the spring and summer days when they are laying like crazy to get us through those leaner seasons in fall and winter when they are not. So eggs. Another one is going to be your meats because you can pretty much freeze dry any type of meat you can imagine, even a ribeye steak. You can do a whole steak, pop that in the freeze dryer, rehydrate it, and you will never know that it was freeze dried to begin with. So meat is going to be the clear winner for food category for freeze drying. Another one is going to be your dairy products. Now, the manuals say to not freeze dry dairy products. So there is a fine line here. There is a category of gray of what's okay and what's not okay. So I'm not going to get into that in this video because I really just want to stick to comparing freeze drying versus dehydrating versus just focusing solely on freeze drying. But we are limited still, even with our dairies, in the freeze dryer. Another food category that the freeze dryer wins hands down, and that is going to be leftovers or complete meals. Because leftovers often have a lot of meat and dairy in them, they just do not dehydrate well. Now you can make specific recipes. I'm thinking specifically about a chili recipe that I've done in the past where I cooked it all up, put it on lined trays in my dehydrator, my Excalibur dehydrator, and that dehydrated fine. But you have to be very picky about what types of complete meals you do in your dehydrator versus a freeze dryer. If you have a pot of food left over from supper, you can literally just pour that straight onto your freeze dryer trays and put it in your freeze dryer. So it is fantastic for getting up bagged complete meals fast and for helping you not waste leftovers. If that's something that is an issue of eating leftovers, you can package those up and build your long-term food storage in that way. Now, everything else that I didn't list, your fruits, veggies, greens, herbs, powders, like fruit and vegetable based powders, all of those do fantastic in both the dehydrator and freeze dryer, but you definitely don't need a freeze dryer to do all of those things in the dehydrator. So there is the food categories of both, and now I want to move into the kind of cons, like pros and cons of a freeze dryer and a dehydrator. So with the freeze dryer, the pros and the con, or the pro and the con, I'm only going to list one significant one for each one. And the pro and the con is the same, which is a little strange, but let me explain. I think the biggest con of a freeze dryer is how quickly it reabsorbs moisture. So as a pro, that's actually one of the reasons why I love freeze drying, is because they rehydrate so quickly. First of all, snacking on freeze-dried foods is delicious because those flavors are so concentrated because all the water and the moisture has been taken out, and you're just left with so much flavor, and it becomes an airy, I'm trying to think of, have y'all ever had those um, puffed green pea chips at the store? I think they actually are freeze dried, which makes sense of why they have this texture. But it's just a very light, airy, it almost feels like styrofoam. Doesn't taste like styrofoam, thank goodness, but it almost feels like styrofoam, and you can just snack on those. Don't have to rehydrate them at all. You can even serve them up, like we do homemade Lunchables for my children, and we'll just put a side of different things, and a freeze-dried little container of vegetables or fruits is a fantastic side dish to just eat as is, no rehydrating. You can't do that a whole lot with a dehydrator. You can for some, certainly, but for the most part, a dehydrator, the texture is just a little bit too hard and a little bit too chewy to be super desirable as compared to a freeze dryer. So I love the fact that freeze-dried foods, number one, don't have to be rehydrated to enjoy them, but number two, they rehydrate so quickly, so they don't add any time hardly at all to my dinner prep. I can put the freeze-dried foods directly into meals without having to rehydrate them first for most things, but even if I do have to rehydrate them first, you're talking 3, 4, 5 minutes and it's done. Now, that is also the biggest con that I see of freeze-dried foods because they seem so finicky when the post freeze drying process, when I'm going into storage. I have had more freeze dried foods regain their moisture inside of a sealed jar than I have regular dehydrated foods. And I will say this, I do know that especially if you don't package them just right with the dehydrated foods, they can reabsorb moisture in a sealed jar, but I have never had that happen to me. And I have been dehydrating for almost a decade. So the fact that I have never had a dehydrated food in a sealed jar or bag rehydrate or take in enough moisture to become pliable and squishy again, meaning it's not good anymore, says a lot, versus I've only had the freeze dryer that's going into my second year now, and I have had multiple jars regain their moisture inside of that jar. And that's just frustrating because number one, I don't want to serve my family anything that I don't know is 110% safe. So when I see a freeze-dried food that is now squishy and sticky and I can tell it has regained some of that moisture, I just have to toss it because I do not want to feed that to my family and risk this botulism type risk, because botulism needs moisture to grow. It only needs about 10% moisture content, which isn't a whole lot. So that's been frustrating. So I think the quickness of how quickly they rehydrate is both the number one pro and the number one con of freeze drying. With a dehydrated food, it is just a matter of pouring that dehydrated food, as long as you follow all the signs, look for all the signs, and make sure it is thoroughly dry before going into your jar or bag. Dehydrated foods are just pouring them into the jar, sealing them. I usually do use my brake bleeder, get a good vacuum seal on them, and onto my shelf they go for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Never had any issues. That's not been the case with freeze-dried foods. I feel like I have to freeze dry them way longer than I should. I have to do all these moisture checks and then vacuum seal it, put an oxygen absorber in it first, and then vacuum seal it. And then like every 2 weeks, I'm going in there and I'm trying to pop the lids and make sure there isn't any of that vacuum leakage at all. So the finickiness of the rapidly able to be re-moisturized, that's not the word, rehydrated for freeze-dried food, biggest pro, biggest con. Okay, pros and cons of dehydrators. The flip side of that, which I kind of discussed it at the same time, is just the non-finickiness of the dehydrator. For ease of use, there is hands down no competition whatsoever between a freeze dryer and a dehydrator. The dehydrator wins time and time again for ease of use. If you are just now getting into food preservation or food storage or gardening and you're wanting to put up that harvest, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you start with a that you start with a dehydrator and not even worry about that freeze drying yet, which I'll talk more in just a minute about when should we start maybe recommending getting a freeze dryer. But the other con of a dehydrator, so pro is ease of use, hands down, so easy, so simple. It doesn't require this huge massive learning curve. The dehydrated foods stay dried as long as you make sure they're fully dry before they go into the jar. So the biggest con I would say with the dehydrator is, and I couldn't really narrow this down to one, so I have two, and the first one is limited variety. Compared to the freeze dryer, now that I've had the freeze dryer for almost 2 years now, the almost unlimited things of what I can put into the freeze dryer has kind of spoiled me a little bit and has made me realize how limited the dehydrator is. But at the same time, I dehydrated for 8 years, almost a decade before even having a freeze dryer, and I used it for everything you can think of, except for like what I mentioned earlier, which is your dairies and your meats and eggs and stuff like that. So yes, it's limited in variety, but it's kind of like my husband and I were talking the other day that my oldest son was almost 5 years old before he ever had his first sip of soda. It was a Sprite. He was walking by and on his 5th birthday party, guzzling a Sprite, and we were like, "What are you doing? Where'd you get that?" It was grandma. Actually, it was great grandma, so she gets a pass. But anyway, it's kind of like that. If you don't even know it exists, you don't even know that good, better thing exists, then you are perfectly happy with this other thing that works really, really good, like my son, who is perfectly happy with his juice and milk and water, who didn't even know about the world of sodas yet. But once he got that sip of soda, then it started. It entered that fight between soda and water, soda and water. So I was very, very happy with my dehydrator before I ever experienced a freeze dryer, and I am still happy with it today. But the second con that I will say is the hardness of the finished product even after rehydrating. Now they definitely soften up and it definitely can rehydrate, but it will never be exactly the same consistency as the food when you put it into the dehydrator. It's going to be very, very close. Close enough that many people will not even notice it, and close enough to where you can still absolutely fix your complete meals with your dehydrated foods. I have been doing it for years. We have several videos here on this channel of where we have showed you how to cook with dehydrated foods, and those were mostly dehydrated foods, not freeze-dried foods. So it's definitely not a deal breaker by any means, but now that I have experienced the freeze-dried foods, when you rehydrate those, they rehydrate almost just like the fruit or veggie or meat or whatever it is that you put into the trays to begin with. I could definitely tell a difference between the dehydrator and the foods coming out of that after rehydrating those they tend to maintain just a little tiny bit of chewiness despite no matter what texture was when you put it in, they seem to get a little bit chewy even after rehydrating, and sometimes a little bit hard even after rehydrating. Not so hard that you're biting in, you're going to break a tooth or anything. I don't mean like that. I just mean compared to a freeze dryer, the dehydrated foods just don't rehydrate as beautifully and as closely to its original state as possible as the freeze dryer does. Okay, so last but not least, well, I am going to show you these side-by-sides in just a second, but with all of that I just said, I want to recommend my personal opinion, and that's all this is, personal opinion. Do your own research, do what is going to be best for your family, of course. I just want to share my opinion because it has been asked of me through comments and through emails, but who would I or when would I recommend each device? And I think I mentioned it already that if you're just starting, if you're new, highly, highly recommend a dehydrator. I don't see, and this is the opinion, the shocking opinion, I guess I guess I should say, as that I mentioned earlier on in the video, that even though I didn't have to pay for my freeze dryer, so I would think I would be all gung-ho about it, but I actually prefer my dehydrator over the freeze dryer just for ease of use. I am all about simplicity. I just like things to be as streamlined as possible. If something is not working, I will dedicate time to fixing that issue so that I can enjoy a streamlined experience after that. And the dehydrator meets that simplicity and ease of use need, whereas the freeze dryer, I just don't know if I would be willing today to invest the money that it would take to purchase the freeze dryer at the prices that they are right now. The only thing that I'm kind of still on the fence of if it's worth it or not is it allows me to put up my garden harvest twice as fast, because let's say I get in, I'm totally throwing out a number here, but let's say we have 40 pounds of carrots come in from the garden. I can do a canner load of carrots and I can do a freeze dryer load of carrots in the freeze dryer, and they can be running at the same time. So at the end of that 24-hour period, I can have double the amount of food preserved on my shelf versus having to only can or only dehydrate, which I don't really super love sliced dehydrated carrots because of the whole rehydration thing. I like shredded dehydrated carrots, but anyway. So if you are someone who is going to be, you have a significant goal and you are pushing hard towards that goal of putting up a year's worth of food from your garden, or purchasing food at the absolute rock bottom prices, and I mean you are looking hard for those deals and you are getting gallons upon gallons upon gallons of food for ridiculously low prices, then that is the situation where I think a freeze dryer is going to show you a return on your investment. When you're able to put up that garden harvest twice as fast, when you're able to preserve twice as much food, and you're able to capitalize on those ridiculously cheap sales that only happen seasonally, right? The blueberries are only going to be cheap right at blueberry harvest time. Same thing for strawberries and cabbage and all of that. So if you are someone who does that, then I would recommend the freeze dryer, looking into it. But I absolutely love the dehydrator, and still to this day, even after having a freeze dryer for free and being able to use it for almost 2 years, I still love my dehydrator slightly more than the freeze dryer. Okay, so I have some side-by-side samples up here for you, and I just want to show you the difference in texture and the look of it. This is freeze-dried. You can see that the freeze-dried foods don't lose mass near as much as dehydrated foods. Dehydrated foods shrink down to at least half their size, if not more, just a fraction of their size, whereas freeze-dried foods retain almost the same size of mass as when they went into the freeze dryer in the first place. Another difference is I'm gonna show you the hardness factor and the styrofoam factor of the freeze-dried food versus dehydrated food. So here is a freeze-dried onion. It is so light, and watch me crush it. I mean, I can essentially powder it with my fingers. It is very, very lightweight. Whew! Smells so strong still. That's another thing I do love about the freeze dryer, is as soon as you open up that jar of food that has been stored properly, the smell that hits you, you can tell it was preserved at the peak freshness, and that is one of the benefits of dehydrating for sure. Excuse me, freeze drying. With the dehydrator, when I pop this open, I'm going to get a little bit of a smell of an onion, but it's not going to be anywhere near what that freeze dryer was. Okay, here is red onion dehydrated. You can see much smaller. Much smaller. Here is a chunk of freeze-dried red onion versus a slice of dehydrated red onion. This one is hard and shriveled and a lot smaller. This one is pretty much maintained the same texture or same size. So here's the dehydrated. I don't know if you heard that, but that snap. These are very hard. I'm trying to pinch it down in between my fingers and they will not crush at all. Let me get a lot of them. I am doing the same thing I was doing with those freeze-dried onions, and it's just not, they're just very, very hard. And when they rehydrate, it's like I was saying earlier, they don't rehydrate as beautifully as freeze-dried foods, but still totally, completely usable. Next, side by side is cabbage. Here is freeze-dried cabbage, and here is dehydrated cabbage. Again, the dehydrated cabbage rehydrates so fast. It's wonderful for your fried potatoes and cabbage recipes, getting some sausage. I'm just going to crumble some up there. Just like pretty much all of your freeze-dried foods are going to crumble into almost a powder in your hands. You don't even need a machine. Versus the dehydrated foods being pretty hard. I mean, look at this right here. You hear that snap? Putting right up to the microphone. It's just very, very hard. And there's no way I can powder it with my fingers with the dehydrated food. So here's the last one, and I won't take these out of the jar because you can tell this is dehydrated zucchini, squash and zucchini. There's yellow and green in there, squash and zucchini. This is freeze-dried zucchini. So you can tell the difference. Thicker, this one shrunk down a lot. You can tell this one, let me shake it. They're very, very hard. You can hear them clinking against the jar versus this. It's just a dull because it's just not. I am going to open this. I said I wasn't going to, but I'm going to open this real quick. Just to show you once more how powdery the freeze-dried foods get. And that's one reason why they rehydrate so quickly. But anyway, okay, y'all, I hope that was helpful to you. I hope these side-by-side kind of gave you an idea of kind of what to expect and see the difference between just different types of foods that we use regularly. I will say that all of this food gets used, whether it's freeze-dried, whether it's dehydrated. It is good enough that we are able to use all of it. Nothing has ever, well, I won't say nothing. We did some papaya one time and it was terrible, and I did end up tossing that out. But for the most part, nothing is bad. Even if it comes out of the dehydrator, that might be kind of hard, might be kind of chewy, but it's not bad. It is completely still usable, and it is shelf-stable food that we can turn to for years to come. Okay, y'all, I hope that was helpful to you, and we will see you next time. Bye.